In the vast, unforgiving lands of the Wild West, a mother and her young son were about to face their darkest nightmare. But as danger loomed, one man riding in with the speed of a storm was about to change their fate forever. Would this mysterious cowboy be their savior, or another threat to their fragile lives? The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty plains of the west. The world seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for something to happen, something that would change everything. Clara stood beside her wagon, wiping the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, the dry wind brushing her face like an old friend. She had lived most of her life in this unforgiving land, knowing every crevice and every sound of the earth beneath her boots. But today, something felt different, off like a storm, that couldn't decide whether to break or not. Beside her, young John, barely 6, played with a wooden toy, oblivious to the weight of the air around them. They were on their way to a small town to the east, a place Clara hoped would offer the safety they had never known. Since her husband's death taken by the harsh winter winds 2 seasons ago, she'd been alone fighting not just the land, but the memories of a love lost. And John, her only child, had been the light in her otherwise dark world. Clara adjusted the shawl around her shoulders and called out to John, "We should rest a while, son. That sun's too much for you." John looked up with a bright smile, the innocence of youth shining through his dirt-smeared face. "I'm not tired, Mama. Let's keep going." But Clara knew better. The last stretch of their journey had been grueling, and it was time to find shelter for the night. She smiled softly, shaking her head, then turned her attention back to the horizon. There in the distance, a cloud of dust appeared, rising steadily, as if being pulled by an unseen hand. Clara's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the wind. A wagon. "John," she said, her voice quieter now, tinged with the unease she felt. "Get inside now." Her words were barely out when the thundering of hooves reached her ears. She turned just in time to see a group of men riding hard coming toward her. Her breath caught in her throat as they drew closer, their faces twisted with something more sinister than the heat of the sun. "Stay back," Mama John shouted, clutching the toy to his chest. Clara's mind raced. She had heard stories, had seen it in the eyes of women in the towns she'd passed, what these men could do. But she'd never thought it would come for her. She stepped forward, placing herself between the approaching riders and her son, her heart pounding in her chest. "Don't take him," she whispered under her breath, though she knew it was already too late. The leader of the group, a man with a scar across his face and eyes as cold as stone, spurred his horse to a halt right in front of her. "We don't want no trouble, ma'am. Just hand over the boy, and no one gets hurt." Clara's breath hitched. She could feel the ground beneath her feet shift, the weight of her choices bearing down on her. She clutched John to her side, the boy trembling in her arms. "You'll have to kill me first," she said, her voice steady, though the fear gnawed at her insides. The words felt like the last breath of a dying woman, but she stood her ground. The man smiled darkly, pulling a knife from his belt. "If that's how it's gotta be, then so be it." But just as he moved toward her, a sharp, echoing crack split the air. A gunshot. Clara flinched, but the man faltered, his expression flickering with confusion. From behind, a voice rang out calm and sure. "You'll want to put that knife down." The leader of the bandits turned sharply, eyes wide with disbelief. Another shot rang out, this one closer, but not aimed at him. The sound of hooves grew louder, and a figure on horseback appeared, silhouetted against the setting sun. A man, a cowboy dressed in worn leathers, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. His gun was raised steady in his hand. "You," the bandit leader sneered. "You think you can stop us?" The cowboy didn't flinch. He slowly lowered his gun, but only for a moment. "I reckon you're mistaken. he said, his voice low, gravelly, carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much. "You've picked the wrong woman to mess with." Another gunshot. The bandit leader's knife flew from his hand, and Clara let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. The remaining men shifted nervously, realizing their fight was no longer with her, but with him. "Get the boy," the leader hissed, signaling to one of his men. But the cowboy was faster. He was on them in an instant, his horse moving with the fluidity of a man who had lived by his wits and his gun. One by one, the bandits were disarmed, forced to their knees in the dust, their weapons clattering uselessly to the ground. The cowboy's eyes never left Clara as he rode up to her, dismounting with a single fluid motion. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked, his voice as steady as the desert winds, though there was a softness behind the words that caught Clara off guard. She nodded, too stunned to speak at first. "Thank you," she finally whispered, her voice breaking the gravity of the situation sinking in. She hadn't realized how much fear had gripped her until now, when it all began to release like a dam breaking. "Name's Tom," the cowboy said, offering her a hand. Clara hesitated, but took it. His grip was firm, his calloused fingers warm against her own. She felt something stir within her, relief, gratitude, and then the weight of everything they'd just escaped. As he helped her up, Clara glanced back at her son, still trembling in the wagon. He reached out to her, his tiny hand stretched towards her like a lifeline. Tom watched her, his gaze softening. "We'll get you to a safe place," he said. "Ain't no more trouble here." And in that moment, for the first time in what felt like forever, Clara believed him. The calm of the desert settled over them once more, and Clara felt something new, something she hadn't known she needed. Hope. For the first time in years, Clara wasn't alone. The dust hung in the air like a shroud over the small, desolate town. It was a place that had forgotten the sweetness of life long ago, a place where people came to forget their sins, or perhaps to be buried with them. Clara's hands trembled as she clutched her son John to her chest, feeling the weight of his tiny, fragile body pressed against her. They had traveled for days, trying to escape the darkness that had taken root in their lives. Her husband long gone, his heart taken by the war, his love stolen by another. He had left her with only grief, and with it a sense of betrayal that she could never erase. John's father had never told her he was leaving. He just walked out like a ghost who had never been real. Clara wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all. But all that came out were silent sobs, tears that fell into the dust at her feet. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as the sound of horses' hooves grew louder. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She knew they were close. The men who had followed her for days had finally caught up. They had their eyes on her, on John, and this time there would be no escape. A rough voice, gruff and hard like the stone beneath her feet, called out, "You're coming with us, woman. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Clara froze. They were too close now, and her heart sank with a weight she couldn't shake. The sound of metal clinking, leather creaking, was all too familiar now. She closed her eyes, waiting for the inevitable. Then, the sharp crack of a gunshot split the air. Tom Montgomery had been tracking these men for weeks. He didn't know exactly why he'd let the hunt stretch this long, but he knew that when the right moment came, he would make them regret it. He had seen too many innocent people suffer, women, children, because of men like these. Men who used violence and fear, like a blade cutting through the lives of the weak, without care. His horse pounded the dirt as he rode into the small town, his eyes scanning the horizon. It wasn't the first time he'd heard that desperate plea for help, but this time it was personal. This time it was a child. Tom's eyes narrowed as he spotted Clara, her face pale with fear, her hands trembling as she clutched her son. And there, just a few feet away, the bastards who had been terrorizing her. He pulled the reins sharply to the left, his horse skidding to a stop with a roar of hooves. The wind whipped through his hair as he drew his gun, the steel gleaming in the sun. "Get your filthy hands off her." His voice was low, but carried the weight of a promise. The leader of the group, a man with cruel eyes and a scar running down his cheek, turned toward him, sneering. "And what are you gonna do about it, cowboy? You think you're some kind of hero?" Tom didn't answer. Instead, he took aim and fired. The bullet ripped through the air and struck the man's hand, sending his gun flying. The bandits scattered their bravado, faltering. They had underestimated the man on horseback. Tom didn't wait for them to regroup. With a swift motion, he dismounted his boots, hitting the dust with a heavy thud. He moved toward Clara, his eyes never leaving the men who were now retreating, their faces twisted in fear. "You're safe now," Tom said, his voice rough but soothing. He reached out to Clara, his hand warm against her trembling one. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. Tom's eyes softened as he crouched down to John's level, offering a small smile. "You're all right now, kid." Clara watched him, still unsure of how to respond. This man, this stranger, had saved her and her son. But there was something in his eyes that made her hesitate, something raw and untold. The town had quieted again, and the dust began to settle as Tom helped Clara to her feet. He didn't say anything for a long while, his gaze distant as he scanned the horizon. It was clear he wasn't one for idle words. Clara stood there, still clutching John close to her, her mind racing. She had no idea who this man was, why he had helped them, or what had driven him to act with such force. All she knew was that for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of safety. But it was more than that. It was something deeper. A connection. "I don't trust Easy," Tom finally spoke, breaking the silence. His voice was steady like the wind that cut across the plains. "But you and your boy don't have to run no more. You're safe here." Clara's throat tightened. The last few days had been filled with fear, and yet in this moment with Tom standing in front of her, there was a flicker of hope. She didn't know what it was, but there was something in him, something familiar, something like home. "My name's Clara," she said, her voice trembling. "This is my son, John." Tom nodded. "Tom, you're both welcome to stay as long as you need. I'm not much for company, but I know what it's like to lose everything." His eyes flicked toward the horizon again, as if the past was pulling at him just like it had been pulling at her. Clara could feel the weight of his words heavy with unspoken history. She didn't push. She knew better than to ask too many questions too soon. But something inside her stirred, something she hadn't felt in years. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. "You've given me something I didn't think I could have again." Tom looked at her, then really looked at her, his eyes softer than they had been. "Sometimes you don't have to say anything. Sometimes just being here is enough." Clara swallowed hard, her chest tight. She wasn't sure if it was the heat of the moment, the danger they'd escaped, or something else entirely. But she felt a shift inside her. Something that hadn't been there for a long time. A sense of belonging, of being seen. For the first time in so long, Clara allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something good, of something better. The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the empty street. Tom and Clara walked in silence, the air between them charged with unspoken words. Clara's heart was still heavy with the loss of her past, but she felt lighter now, like a weight had been lifted. For the first time, she could see a future. And maybe, just maybe, Tom Montgomery had given her the first step toward healing. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dirt road of the small frontier town. The air was thick with dust, the kind that lingered in your lungs, and tasted of the earth itself. The saloon doors swung open, and the sound of horses' hooves echoed in the stillness as a lone rider approached. Clara stood by the wagon, her hands trembling as she held John close. His small body pressed against hers, seeking comfort, but neither of them could shake the feeling of being hunted. They had barely escaped one nightmare, only to find themselves on the cusp of another. Tom, standing just a few feet away, his back to the dusty street, seemed like a man carved from stone. His broad shoulders flexed beneath the worn leather of his vest. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon. Every nerve in his body was alert, every muscle taut, waiting for the inevitable. "Stay close, Clara." Tom said, his voice low, steady, yet carrying an unspoken command. "Don't let go of him, not for a second." Clara nodded, the words unspoken, but understood. In the silence that followed, she could hear the distant thudding of hooves growing louder. The storm was coming. From the corner of her eye, she saw a figure emerge from the shadows. A man tall and broad, his hat tipped low to obscure his face. Behind him, a group of men on horseback, their eyes glinting with malice, rode in formation like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. Clara's breath hitched. Her heart thundered in her chest as she tightened her grip on John. She had seen these men before. They were the same ones who had attacked them the first time, the same ones who had torn her world apart. Tom stepped forward, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. He didn't draw it yet, but Clara could feel the tension in the air, the silent understanding between them that this was a moment that would define everything. "Leave 'em be, Cartwright." Tom's voice rang out, cutting through the oppressive silence. His words were calm, almost too calm, but there was a steel edge to them, a promise of violence if necessary. The man on horseback, Cartwright, looked down at Tom with a smirk that was more a snarl than a smile. "You think you can stop us, cowboy?" he sneered. "You ain't nothing but a rat in a trap, and I got the keys." Clara felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The last time she'd been in this position, she had been helpless, powerless, just a woman caught in the crossfire. But today, she was not the same person. She had seen the fire in Tom's eyes, the kind of fire that could burn the world down if it meant protecting what mattered. She wasn't about to stand aside again. Her voice, though shaky, cut through the thickening tension. "You'll have to go through him first." Tom's gaze flicked to her, a brief flash of warmth in his eyes, before they turned cold again, focused on the men approaching. Cartwright chuckled darkly. "Is that so? Well, let's see if you're worth the trouble." Without warning, the gunfire erupted. The first shot was a warning fired into the air with such force that the sound cracked like thunder. Tom's hand flew to his revolver, drawing it in a fluid motion faster than anyone could blink. The first man fell, his chest erupting in a spray of blood as he collapsed to the ground. Clara gasped instinctively, pulling John closer, her back pressed against the rough wood of the wagon as she tried to shield him from the violence. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her eyes remained fixed on Tom, watching as he moved with deadly grace. The second man fired, but Tom was already behind a nearby barrel, crouched low and waiting. He didn't hesitate. One shot, two shots, two more bodies crumpled to the dirt. "Tom." Clara's voice rang out a desperate plea. She couldn't help herself. But Tom didn't flinch. His focus was absolute. His gun was an extension of himself, his movements calculated and precise. The sound of hooves approaching from behind jolted Clara out of her daze. There were more of them. Too many. She looked to Tom, but he was already several steps ahead, his eyes scanning his mind, working faster than hers. He was prepared, but she was not. And for a split second, she feared they would both be lost to this chaos. Then, in a flash, a third man rode up, gun raised, aiming directly at Tom. Clara's heart stopped. She saw it all unfold in slow motion. She saw the flash of the gun, saw the fury in the man's eyes, but before the shot could fire, Tom was there, his revolver drawn, his hand steady. The shot rang out with perfect precision, the bullet striking the man's hand, sending his gun flying. The man screamed, clutching his wrist in agony, and Tom advanced. He didn't waste time. "Get out of here!" Tom growled, his voice low and unyielding. "Before I finish what you started." The remaining men, seeing their comrades fall, turned and fled, the sound of their retreating hooves echoing through the town like the wind after a storm. Tom didn't move immediately. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground where the men had fallen, the weight of what had just transpired hanging heavy in the air. It wasn't a victory. It was survival, and that was all. Clara felt her knees give way, but she didn't collapse. She held her son tighter, trying to shield him from the aftermath, trying to shield herself. The silence that followed was deafening. The world had changed, yet somehow it felt the same. Tom walked toward her slowly, his boots kicking up the dust as he moved. His face was calm, but his eyes held something darker, something she couldn't quite place. But it wasn't anger. It was regret. "You okay?" he asked softly, his voice rough but sincere. Clara nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was answering for herself or for the world that had been shattered in front of her. You saved us." He paused, his hand hovering over his revolver, his knuckles tight. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 battles fought and lost. "I didn't save you," Tom said quietly, his voice almost lost in the wind. "I just bought us time." Clara didn't know what to say to that. She didn't know if there was anything left to say. But as she looked into Tom's eyes, she saw something that made her chest ache with understanding. A promise, a truth. And for the first time in a long time, she believed in it. The sun dipped low behind the dusty hills, casting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. The air hung thick with the dust of a land that never seemed to forgive, and Clara stood frozen at the foot of a creaking wooden wagon. Her breath, shallow and ragged, matched the rhythm of her heartbeat. Her eyes never left the rough hands of the man who held her captive, dragging her closer to the open wagon where the boy John was bound in fear. A sharp, cold edge sliced through the heavy air. A gunshot rang, cutting through the silence like a knife. The man holding Clara flinched, pulling her roughly against his chest, the metallic taste of fear flooding her senses. She couldn't make out the source of the shot at first, but then, as if summoned by fate itself, a rider appeared on horseback. His silhouette, a tall, lean figure, framed by the endless horizon, cut across the scene with a quiet power. Tom, the cowboy who had become her savior in a world long bereft of mercy. The steed galloped fiercely, hooves striking the dirt in rhythm with her racing heart. Tom's hand gripped the reins with the same precision he used to wield a gun, and as he neared, he drew it from his holster with a fluid motion that seemed almost inevitable. One shot, 2 shots each, finding its mark and scattering the remaining cogs of the criminal machine in disarray. "Let her go." Tom's voice was low, steady, a voice that carried more than just a threat. It was the voice of a man who had lived through storms both real and imagined, and now carried them in his bones. The man holding Clara stammered, his hand shaking as he reached for his own weapon. But the gun was no match for the cold barrel of Tom's revolver, which hovered between his eyes with a quiet certainty. Clara could feel her body tense as she was pulled back to reality. The sound of the gunshot still rang in her ears, but it was Tom's steady presence that began to clear the fog from her mind. His calm was everything she wasn't. In the midst of the chaos, she could hear the faint cry of John, still in the wagon, still frightened. "Take him, he's just a boy." The man spat, his voice thick with venom. "You ain't gonna get anything out of me. I already got what I needed." Tom replied, his words calm but full of weight. He swung down from his horse with the ease of someone accustomed to the violence of the land, but unwilling to let it dictate him. His eyes found Clara's, and for a brief fleeting moment, they shared a quiet understanding. This wasn't just a rescue. This was more. Tom motioned for Clara to move toward him, but she hesitated, still bound by the invisible chains of fear and past betrayal. "Come on, ma'am," he said, his voice softer now, but still firm. "You're safe now." Safe. The word felt foreign on her tongue. How long had it been since she had truly felt safe? She glanced at John, still trembling in the wagon. He was a small boy, no older than 7, his face pale with fear. But when he saw Tom, something shifted in the child's eyes. The terror was still there, but so was a glimmer of hope. He looked at Clara, then to Tom, as if to say, "Is he one of the good ones?" Clara finally nodded, the simplest movement that spoke volumes. With that, she took Tom's hand, feeling the warmth of it, strong, sure, and silent. "Thank you," she whispered, not knowing if she was thanking him for the rescue, for the promise of safety, or for something deeper, the unspoken trust that had been forged in the chaos of those few moments. The journey back to Tom's cabin was quiet, punctuated only by the rhythmic pounding of hooves and the occasional soft breath from Clara as she tried to calm her shaking hands. Tom led the way, his horse galloping at a steady pace, and Clara followed on foot, guiding John along beside her. The cabin was a small, weathered structure, nestled in a copse of trees. It had been a long time since anyone had called it a home, but there was something about it, something about the way Tom had tended to it, that made it feel welcoming, despite the hard edges of its exterior. Inside, Tom set about tending to his horses, and Clara helped John to a chair by the fireplace. The warmth of the fire felt like a balm to her chilled bones, but the ache in her chest remained. She had been saved, but what of the damage done? What of the wounds that couldn't be seen? Tom, sensing the distance in her, didn't speak at first. He simply moved about the cabin, his presence steady and constant. Clara sat there in the quiet, her thoughts spinning, the enormity of what had just happened settling like a weight on her chest. After a long while, Tom finally turned to her. His voice, when it came, was low, almost reluctant, as if he had been carrying something heavy himself. "It's a hard world out here, but I reckon you know that." Clara swallowed, looking down at her hands. The memory of the cold, rough hands that had held her, threatened her, still clung to her skin. "I know," she whispered. "I used to think it was the world that was cruel. But maybe it's just the people in it." A shadow passed over Tom's face, and for a moment the walls he had so carefully built around himself seemed to falter. He didn't reply at first, but then he spoke again, his voice quieter, almost like a confession. "I used to think the same thing," he said. "But there's a difference, you see. You can let the cruel ones define the world for you, or you can make your own world out of the kindness you choose to offer." Clara's breath caught in her throat. For a moment she was lost in the weight of his words, the realization dawning on her like the first light of dawn breaking through the darkness. "Is that what you've done?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Tom met her gaze, and for the first time she saw something more than the hardened cowboy, a man who had been through battles both internal and external, and had chosen to survive with a shred of decency left intact. "I try," he said simply. "That's all any of us can do. Try." The night stretched long, filled with the soft crackle of the fire and the quiet sounds of the wilderness outside. Clara couldn't say when it happened, but she felt a shift within herself, something she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was beginning to heal. And for the first time in a long while, as she sat in the warmth of that small cabin with Tom and John, She allowed herself the luxury of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could find her way back to the person she once was, the woman who could love and trust again. In the quiet that followed as Tom worked by the fire, Clara closed her eyes. Her heart, for the first time in many years, felt a little less heavy. The wind whispered through the dry plains, carrying with it the weight of years spent in solitude, in a place where time itself seemed to be held prisoner. Tom sat on the porch of the small cabin, his eyes fixed on the horizon, though they saw little of the setting sun. His hands, worn and calloused, rested on his knees, his fingers tracing invisible lines of regret in the dirt. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden boards beneath him. It had been 3 years since he'd come to this place, a cabin just beyond the edge of the world. A place where he thought no one would find him. A place where he could bury his past and forget the things he had done, the things he had failed to do. But no matter how far he ran, the ghosts always found him. Clara had noticed it first, the way he sometimes drifted away in the middle of their quiet conversations, the way his gaze would cloud over distant and cold, as if he was no longer sitting there with her. It was in those moments that she began to wonder about him, to wonder about the man who had saved her, the man who had brought her to safety, but never spoke of his own. Tom. Clara's voice was soft, tentative, the kind of voice a woman uses when she's trying to unlock something from a man who's learned to lock himself away. He didn't answer right away. He never did. But she had learned to wait for him to give him space. Space to breathe. Space to speak or not speak. "Tom," she said again, stepping closer to him, her voice firm but gentle. "What's your story?" For a moment, nothing. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the porch. Finally he turned his head, his expression unreadable. His eyes, once as soft as the open sky, now held the storm of a life lived in the shadows. "There's not much to tell," he said, his voice rough, as though it hadn't been used in years. "Born in a town that never asked questions, raised by a man who didn't believe in answers." His lips tightened as if the words were bitter on his tongue. "I wasn't much different than my father, and he wasn't much different than the men I ran with." Clara stood quietly waiting, though she knew his words weren't easy. They were never easy. "My father, he taught me to fight." Tom continued the words, coming slowly now, as though each one carried the weight of 1,000 memories. "Taught me that a man's worth is measured by how many fists he can throw and how many he can take. I learned that lesson well. I was good at it." His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Too good." He paused, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. Clara waited, her heart aching for him. "There was a woman," he said after a long silence. "Her name was Rose. She was the kind of woman who could make you believe in something better, even when you had nothing left to give." His voice cracked for just a moment before he regained his composure. "I loved her. I thought she loved me too. But I was wrong." Clara felt a tightness in her chest, her heart slowing as she listened. She knew where this was going. The pain in his voice was familiar. Something she had heard before in the stories of lost love and broken hearts. But it wasn't just the loss that had torn him apart. It was the betrayal. "The night she left," Tom continued, his words coming in a rush. "Now I was drunk, angry. She told me she couldn't live like that anymore. She said I was destroying myself, and I was destroying everything around me. I thought I could change, but—" He stopped again, the pain too much to voice. "I couldn't, not in time. She took everything with her, and when she left, she took what little I had left of myself." Clara felt the gravity of his words. She stepped closer to him, her heart reaching out to him. "Tom, you didn't deserve that. You don't deserve to carry it alone." He looked at her, then his eyes piercing through the years of pain, the walls he had built so high. His gaze softened just for a moment. I thought I could outrun it," he said quietly. "But some things, some people, they stick with you, no matter where you go. And after she left, I thought the only thing I could do was keep running." He looked down, running a hand through his hair, the weight of his past pressing down on him like an anchor. "I kept running until I found this place. And then I just stopped moving, stopped trying." Clara's heart broke for him in that moment. It saw the man who had lost everything and thought there was nothing left worth saving. She reached out gently, placing a hand on his arm, her touch a silent offering. "You're not alone anymore, Tom. You don't have to keep running. You found something worth staying for." For a long moment, he didn't respond. But then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the land in golden hues, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to her, his expression softer than it had ever been. "I never thought I'd find peace, but I think I'm starting to believe that maybe I can." Clara didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. The silence between them spoke volumes, a quiet understanding passing between them. They both had scars. Both had lost. But now in this moment, they were here together. The confrontation. That night the wind howled outside the cabin, rattling the windows and stirring the dust in the dark corners of the room. It was then that the past came calling again. There was a knock at the door, sharp, demanding. Tom stood immediately, his body tense. He knew who it was before he even opened it. The man standing there, his face twisted in a sneer, held something Tom had hoped never to see again, a piece of his past. "You're still hiding out here, Tom," the man said, his voice low and mocking. "Thought you could run from what you did, from what you are." Tom's jaw tightened. "I didn't come out here to answer to you. You'll answer sooner or later." The man sneered. "You can't bury your sins forever." Clara stepped forward, her eyes flashing. "You'll answer for them," she said coldly, her voice unwavering. "And it won't be in the way you think." Tom looked at her, the weight of her words sinking deep. He knew that moment this confrontation had been inevitable. But he was ready now, ready to face his past and let it go. In the quiet that followed the confrontation, Tom stood at the window staring out into the night. He didn't feel the same weight on his chest anymore. He didn't feel like he was running, not anymore. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope. To believe that maybe, just maybe, he had been given a second chance. And this time, he wasn't going to waste it. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the worn dirt road. A dry breeze stirred the grass at the edge of the homestead, the world seeming to hold its breath, as if waiting for something, or someone. Clara sat on the old wooden porch of the cabin, the edges of her apron worn thin from months of hard work, her hands folded in her lap. Her gaze was distant, lost in a memory she wasn't ready to face. John, her son, had gone to the stream to fetch water, his small form silhouetted against the golden light of the late afternoon. She watched him for a moment, his innocent laughter echoing in the distance, before the weight of the past seemed to press against her chest again. "I don't know how to make it right, Mama." John's words still lingered in the air, the question that had hung between them for days, unspoken, but there. Her son had been trying as children do to understand the world and how things worked even when it didn't make sense. He'd seen the scars on her hands, the faint tremble in her voice when she spoke of Tom. He was too young to understand the complexities of healing, but he wasn't too young to sense the grief that clouded her every step. Tom had come into their lives like a storm, a man with too many secrets, too many regrets. Yet there was something about him, something steady. Clara had allowed herself to trust him a little at first, and now, with each passing day, that trust had woven itself deeper into the fabric of their lives. But there were moments when that trust felt fragile, and Clara found herself questioning if she had done the right thing, if she was doing the right thing for John, for herself. "You don't need to know everything, John," Clara murmured more to herself than to her son. Her voice was low, tinged with the quiet sorrow of the things she hadn't said, the memories she hadn't shared. Sometimes you just need to let things be, and trust that the world has a way of healing itself. She leaned back in her chair, the creak of the old wood accompanying her, as the memory of her own mother flooded her thoughts. Her mother had always said those same words to her, even as Clara, a little girl, had questioned the pain she saw in the world around her. The world hadn't been kind to her. The world had never been kind to women like her. But her mother had always whispered that things would be all right, that they would find their way through the darkness. Clara had believed her back then, but now she wasn't so sure. "Mama, can we stay here forever?" John's voice broke through her thoughts, his face flushed from running. Clara smiled softly, her heart aching for the innocence of her son. "Forever. It's a big word, John, but we're here, and that's enough for now." John's smile was full of hope, his eyes shining with the kind of trust only a child could have. He ran over to her, his small arms reaching up for her. Clara bent down, lifting him into her arms, and for a moment the weight of the world felt a little lighter. His little head rested against her shoulder, his small breaths even and steady. The house felt warmer with John in her arms, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. It had been weeks since Tom had come into their lives, weeks since he had shown them a different kind of life, one filled with both danger and hope. She had tried to bury the doubt, to ignore the voice in her head that told her she had to protect John, that she couldn't keep going down this path with a man who might be hiding something too dark to face. She thought of the night Tom had first arrived, his rough voice steady as he told her to trust him, that he would protect them, that he would keep them safe from whatever came next. But could she really trust him? Could she really trust anyone anymore? "He'll leave us one day, Mama. Just like the others did." John whispered, his voice muffled against her chest. Clara froze. Her heart stuttered in her chest, the words cutting deeper than she cared to admit. "What did you say, John? I heard you talk about how Papa left us. I heard you cry sometimes at night. I think he's gonna leave us too." The rawness of her son's words sent a shudder through Clara's body. She hadn't realized John had heard her cries in the quiet hours of the night, the nights she spent grieving a past she couldn't escape. She had thought she had hidden her pain well enough, but he had known. He had always known. Clara didn't speak at first. Instead, she pulled him tighter to her chest, her hands trembling. "I'm sorry, John. I'm sorry for not being stronger, for not being enough." John looked up at her with wide eyes, a look of confusion on his face. "You're enough, Mama. You always have been." Clara's throat tightened at his words. He was too young to understand the weight of what she had carried for so long, but somehow in that moment she realized something. She didn't need to be strong all the time. She didn't have to carry everything on her own. John needed her, yes, but he also needed to see that it was okay to feel the weight of the world and still keep moving forward. And she needed to let him see that. The door creaked open behind her, and she turned to see Tom standing there, his eyes heavy with something she couldn't quite place. He didn't say anything at first. He simply watched her as if waiting for something. Finally, he spoke. "You know, Clara, I've never been good at this whole thing, being a family." Clara felt a sharp pang of fear, but she didn't let it show. "What do you mean?" Tom stepped closer, his boots kicking up the dust on the porch. "I'm not good at being someone you can rely on. But I'm trying, Clara. I'm trying for you, for John." her breath caught in her throat as she searched his face, the sincerity in his eyes undeniable. "I'm sorry if I've given you the wrong impression, but I need you to know I'm not running. Not from you, not from him." He nodded toward John, who was watching them both, his small hands clutching his mother's sleeve. The tension that had filled the air between them seemed to soften just for a moment. Clara took a breath, then nodded. "I don't know what the future holds, Tom. But for today, for now, I'll take your word for it." Tom reached out his hand, resting gently on John's shoulder. "We'll figure it out, all of us. Together." For the first time in weeks, Clara felt something close to peace settle in her heart. It wasn't a grand promise, and it wasn't a fairy tale ending. But in that quiet moment, under the fading light of the day, Clara realized that healing wasn't just a destination, it was a journey. And maybe, just maybe, they were all ready to take the next step forward together. The wind had picked up swirling dust and the scent of earth around the small cabin. The fire crackled its warmth, and the low murmur of the night creating a fragile peace within the wooden walls. Clara sat by the window, looking out into the dark, where the stars seemed distant, unreachable, just like the life she had left behind. She hadn't realized until now how heavy the silence was, how it clung to everything, even to the air she breathed. The pain, though lessened in the days since Tom had rescued them, still lingered like a scar that hadn't healed. The haunting memory of that day, the cold hands of the kidnappers, the terror in John's eyes, the feeling of helplessness as she was dragged away, was still fresh even now in the quiet safety of this place. The house, though simple, had become a refuge. It was Tom's her savior, her protector, and perhaps unknowingly, her only chance at redemption. But Clara still didn't know how to bridge the gap between the two of them. He had done so much for her, yet there remained a distance, an unspoken boundary. "Clara." Tom's voice broke through her thoughts, low and hesitant. He stood at the door, his figure framed by the fading light of dusk. "You mind if I come in?" She glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips, but it was tinged with uncertainty. "Of course," she said, her voice soft. "It's your house." He nodded, his eyes catching the firelight as he stepped inside his boots, muffled against the wooden floor. Tom had always been a man of few words. His kindness had been silent, almost like a whisper, something that wasn't meant to draw attention to itself, yet it had changed everything for her. But even with that, there was a kind of wall between them, one that she couldn't quite see, but could always feel. He stood beside her, gazing out at the same stars. She had been watching his face, hard to read. "You're quiet tonight," he remarked. Clara shifted in her seat, avoiding his gaze. "Just thinking." She could feel him watching her, but she couldn't bring herself to meet his eyes. There was something about his silence that made everything feel more complicated. But then again, Clara was no stranger to complications. The truth was, she wasn't just thinking about the past few weeks. She was thinking about the years before that. The life she had lived in another place under the thumb of a man who had broken her heart, shattered her trust. Her father, her betrayal, the promises that turned to dust. The memories were sharper now, more vivid than they'd ever been. She had built walls to block them out, but those walls weren't as sturdy as she'd once believed. They cracked with every passing day. "I suppose we both have our ghosts, don't we?" Tom's voice startled her, but his words made her freeze. "I don't know much about what you've gone through, Clara, but I know pain when I see it." Her eyes lifted to meet his, and for the first time there was no barrier between them, no hesitation, just a raw, vulnerable truth. "I don't think we ever truly escape the past," she whispered, almost to herself. Tom didn't respond right away. He sat down beside her, his presence solid and steady. "Maybe we don't," he said after a beat. but we can choose how we let it shape us." Clara's heart tightened at the simplicity of his words. They carried weight, a wisdom born from years of living with his own demons. It made her wonder, was that why she had been so drawn to him, because in his silence, in his stoic resilience, there was a kind of strength that spoke louder than words. The door creaked open again, and Clara's gaze shifted to the child who had been asleep in the corner. John, wide awake and staring at them with those innocent eyes, had probably heard every word. His presence was both a comfort and a reminder of what they had fought to protect. "Ma'am." John's voice was soft, but there was a hint of worry in his tone. "You okay?" Clara looked at him, her heart swelling with a love that was so deep, so protective. It was as if her whole world existed in that little boy. "I'm okay, baby," she said, her voice breaking slightly. John didn't say anything more, but he walked over to her, wrapping his arms around her in a hug that was simple yet full of meaning. "I'm glad we're here," he whispered, burying his face into her side. Tom watched them, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. His eyes softened, but he said nothing. There was a tenderness in the way he looked at Clara and John, like he understood what they had lost, what they had been through. As the night deepened, the air grew colder, and Clara found herself sitting closer to Tom. Their conversation had slowed to a comfortable silence, the kind of silence that spoke of understanding, of two souls, slowly, tentatively finding their way toward one another. And yet, even in the quiet, there were still shadows. Shadows of things unsaid. Tom had his own secrets, things he kept locked away just as Clara had done. But for once in that moment, they didn't feel as if they were alone. The fire flickered, casting warm shadows across the room. Clara leaned back against the wall, feeling a deep weariness settling in her bones. "I don't know what's next for us," she said softly, as if speaking more to herself than to Tom. "But I know I want to be here. I want to try." Tom's hand moved toward hers, his fingers brushing against hers with the lightest touch, a connection that was both tentative and hopeful. "We'll figure it out," he said, "one step at a time." It wasn't much, just a simple gesture, a touch, but in that moment, it was everything. Clara realized that for the first time in a long while, she wasn't alone. She had Tom, she had John, and together, they could rebuild what had been broken. For the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to believe in the possibility of healing. Not all at once, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments, like the way Tom's hand had gently reached for hers, or the way John had clung to her, offering a kind of love that needed no words. "Thank you," Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "for being here." Tom didn't answer with words. Instead, he simply nodded, his hand still resting on hers, an unspoken promise that whatever the future held, they would face it together. And in that moment, Clara felt a quiet peace settle over her, like the first rain after a long drought. It was subtle, but it was there. A beginning. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty plains. The small house that had become home to Clara and Tom sat quietly in the distance, its weathered wood blending into the landscape. The air felt thick, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Tom stood on the porch, staring into the horizon, his eyes narrowing against the harsh wind. It had been weeks since the coyote attack, weeks since they'd been forced to fight for their lives. But Tom knew that peace in this part of the world was as fleeting as the wind. Clara had been inside tending to the fire, but she could sense something was off. The way Tom stood, his back rigid, his jaw set tight, something was coming. She could feel the tension in her bones, a warning she couldn't explain. And then she heard the distant sound of hooves. The first to arrive were the riders. 3 of them. As they crested the hill, their silhouettes cut sharp against the setting sun. They were too well dressed for bandits, but their horses moved with purpose, and their eyes hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats did not offer the kindness that Tom had shown her. She recognized that look. It was a look she had seen in her father's eyes, cold, calculating, and hungry. Tom's hand instinctively went to the revolver at his side. He didn't draw it yet, but his fingers twitched as if they had a mind of their own. Clara, sensing his unease, placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "They won't be a problem," he said, his voice rough but steady. Clara nodded, though her heart beat faster in her chest. She didn't like the sound of his words. He was too sure. She knew Tom could handle himself. But there was something else, something she couldn't explain about these riders. They arrived without a word, their horses coming to a halt in front of the house. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, dismounted first. He glanced at Clara, then at Tom, sizing him up. His eyes weren't just cold, they were calculating. "You the one they call Tom?" The man asked, his voice low and harsh, like a man who hadn't used it for kindness in years. Tom didn't answer right away. He only stepped forward, his presence like a shadow falling over the group. He didn't need to say a word, his stance said it all. "I don't take kindly to visitors." Tom finally replied, his tone flat, no room for negotiation. The man chuckled, stepping closer. "Well, Tom, we're not here to be friendly. We're here to collect." His gaze shifted to Clara. "She's coming with us." Clara's breath hitched. Her legs felt like stone, her body frozen in place. It wasn't the first time she'd felt that cold grip of fear. But this time, it was different. This time she had something to lose. Tom had shown her what it felt like to have a future, to believe in something again. And now these men, they were going to take it all away. "I don't think you understand." Tom said, his voice steady, but his eyes were hard as iron. The man smirked. "I understand just fine. The woman's debt has come due." A chill ran through Clara. Debt. She hadn't heard that word in so long, not since her father's gambling had left them with nothing but dust. Her past, the shadows she'd tried to outrun, had come to find her again. Tom stepped closer, his body now a wall between Clara and the riders. "You'll have to go through me first," he said. Clara saw the flicker of irritation in the man's eyes, but it was the coldness in his voice that made her stomach twist. "Make no mistake, Tom," the man said. "This doesn't end in your favor." Tom's hand moved to his revolver, but Clara's voice stopped him before the air could thicken with violence. "Stop," she whispered, the word barely escaping her lips. She moved slowly from behind Tom, her eyes not leaving the man's. "He's right," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "I've owed this debt for far too long." Tom's eyes turned to her, confusion written across his face. "Clara." But she shook her head, cutting him off. "It's my debt," she said softly, "and I've been running from it my whole life. I can't keep running." The man chuckled again, a low, cruel sound that made Clara's skin crawl. "I knew it. A woman like you, you'd never be free. You don't get to choose when your past comes calling." Clara felt something inside her stir, anger, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel for a long time. She turned to Tom, her eyes fierce now, the fear melting away into something more familiar, resolve. "I have to face it, Tom," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "It's the only way. I'm not running anymore." Tom looked at her for a long moment, his hand still gripping his revolver, but it was his eyes that spoke the loudest. There was a deep understanding there, and beneath the surface, a love that had taken root in the silence between them. "I won't let them take you," Tom said, his voice low and full of that quiet rage he kept hidden. Clara stepped forward, placing her hand on his arm. She didn't need his protection. Not anymore. "We'll face this together," she said, her voice steady now. The man's smile faltered. For a moment his eyes darted between Clara and Tom. He had expected fear, but what he saw was strength. The kind of strength that came not from bullets or fists, but from something much deeper, something they could never take. "Well," the man said with a resigned sigh, "we'll see how long that lasts." With a wave of his hand, the riders turned and began to leave their horses, kicking up the dust as they rode away. Clara and Tom stood in the stillness, the weight of the moment hanging in the air between them. Clara stood silently for a moment, the harsh winds carrying away the last of the tension. Then she turned to Tom. He was still watching her, his face unreadable. But when he met her eyes, she saw something shift in him. He stepped forward slowly, as though unsure. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice quiet but full of emotion. "I didn't want to bring this back into your life." Tom shook his head, the faintest smile touching his lips. "You didn't bring it back, Clara. It was always here waiting for us." The wind had kicked up again, its dry breath swirling the dust across the empty street. Clara stood at the door of the cabin, her hand resting lightly on the worn wood. She could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her, but she couldn't move. Not yet. Her heart still thudded against her ribs, like it had since that first moment of danger. The memory of the cocksure faces of the men who had stolen her freedom, and worse, her sons, haunted her. She had lived with it for days now, watching the sun rise and set, each one a reminder of what she had lost. She closed her eyes briefly, pushing it all back, forcing herself to be strong, even if the weight of the past was always there. But that wasn't what troubled her now. It was the quiet after Tom had walked out hours ago, his boots fading in the distance. He hadn't said goodbye, not a word. Only the hollow sound of his horse's hooves on the dirt path had filled the silence. Clara couldn't understand. She should have seen it coming. She had always known he was a man of few words. He had a way about him, a quiet strength, but also a quiet pain. Yet here he was, now gone without explanation, and she was left in the midst of all the uncertainty. "Are you coming?" John's voice pulled her out of her thoughts, his small face peeking from the shadows of the doorway. She swallowed hard, willing herself to make the choice to do something instead of just waiting. She could feel the weight of his eyes on her, expecting her to make the decision that would shape everything from here on out. "I don't know," she whispered, the words as foreign to her as the silence around them. John took a step forward, his face furrowed with the innocence only a child could possess. "We have to choose, Mom." Clara's heart clenched. Her son didn't understand the gravity of the situation. He couldn't. He was too young. But Clara knew. She had known from the start, from the very first day, that Tom had stepped into their lives. He had given them hope. But could she trust it? Could she trust him? Or was it too late for that? The thought that haunts. Tom hadn't been back for hours, and Clara had spent every one of them replaying the way his eyes had flickered away from her when she asked if he was staying. His expression, so cold for just a moment, had made her question everything she had believed about him. The wind blew the door open then, and Clara stood frozen watching as Tom's figure appeared in the distance. Her heart beat louder, thumping in her chest as his silhouette grew clearer. She didn't move, didn't breathe. He was walking toward her, slow but steady. His boots heavy in the dust, his hat low, hiding the expression that Clara knew too well by now. She could see the strain in his shoulders, in the way his hands hovered near his sides, the weight of some decision that was neither easy nor clear. "Clara!" he called out when he was a few feet away. His voice, so soft, cracked with a tinge of something far deeper than either of them had acknowledged. "Where did you go?" Her voice, barely a whisper, betrayed the hurt that had already started to settle in her heart. Tom didn't answer right away. His eyes met hers, and for the first time Clara saw the shadows of the man he used to be, the one who had buried the weight of his past beneath layers of scars, the one who had walked through life without allowing anyone to get too close. But now his gaze softened. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with words unsaid. Clara shook her head. She didn't need his apology. She needed something else. She needed to know if they could move forward together, or if this was the end. "I don't understand you, Tom," she whispered, feeling the tears well up in her eyes. "I've seen your strength, your heart, but I can't." She choked on the words, the confusion and pain squeezing her chest so tightly it felt like it might burst. "I can't keep hoping you'll come back to me after you've left me in the dark." For a long moment, Tom didn't respond. He stood there silent, as though processing every word she'd said. And then, in that stillness, something shifted between them. The hard truth. "Clara." Tom's voice broke the silence, his words low, gravelly. "I've lived too many years believing that being alone was easier, and I thought maybe I was saving you from what I knew would come from what we both knew would come." He paused, lifting his gaze to meet hers, his eyes filled with something raw. "But I never meant to hurt you. I thought I was doing what was right." Clara took a shaky breath. The weight of his words hung between them, and her hands trembled as she wiped away the single tear that had escaped. "You don't get to decide what's right for me," she said, her voice firmer now despite the ache. I'm not someone to be saved. I want to choose. I want to choose to be with someone, not because I'm broken, but because we can build something." Tom's breath caught in his throat, his shoulders sagging as though he had been carrying a weight much heavier than she had realized. "I never meant to hurt you, Clara, but I was afraid." His voice cracked. "I was afraid of what it would mean to stay, to truly stay." The healing moment. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Clara took a step toward him. She didn't know why or how she could forgive him for the hurt he had caused, but standing here, watching him, seeing him so vulnerable, something shifted within her. She stepped closer, still reaching out to him, offering him the one thing he had refused to accept. "I'm not asking you to save me, Tom. I'm asking you to stay." Tom's expression softened, and as he stepped forward, their hands met a quiet promise settling between them. There were no grand gestures, no grand declarations, only the silent understanding that they would face the storm together. In that moment, Clara realized that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but about accepting it together. And for the first time, she felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by the fragile but undeniable promise of a future built on trust, love, and the quiet strength they had found in one another. The sun was dipping low in the sky, casting a golden glow across the land. The wind, warm and dusted with the scent of sage, whispered through the trees, as though it carried with it the weight of years of secrets, of regrets, of things unsaid. Clara sat on the porch, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes distant as she stared into the horizon. Her thoughts were far away back in the days when things were simpler, when she was a young woman full of dreams and hopes that hadn't yet been broken. There was a time when she believed that life was supposed to be full of love, and that love was a promise made to last. But promises like the wind were fickle. The air around her seemed to hold a stillness, a quiet before the storm, as if the earth itself was bracing for the truths that were about to be revealed. Tom stood beside her, his presence as constant as the mountains in the distance. He was the one who had saved her, who had shown her that life, even in its harshest moments, still held moments of grace. But today, something was different. He had become quiet, his usual steady gaze now heavy with the weight of something unspoken. "Tom," Clara said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "I've known you long enough to see when something's weighing on your soul." "What is it?" She didn't ask out of fear, but out of the kindness that had grown between them, that quiet understanding that only time and shared moments could build. Tom's eyes met hers, and for a long moment he said nothing. The lines of his face were etched with age, the kind that came from living hard and fast, from burying pieces of yourself in the dust of the land. He exhaled slowly, as if preparing to share a secret buried deep inside him. "I've done things I'm not proud of, Clara," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Things I thought I could bury, but they come back. They always come back." Clara reached out her hand, resting on his arm, the touch warm and grounding. "We all have things we're not proud of," she murmured. "It's how we face them that matters." Tom nodded, but his eyes were distant, as if the land itself was calling him to face something more than just his past. His fingers clenched around the worn leather of his gun belt, the metal cool against his skin. "There's a truth I've been hiding from you, Clara." He said the words coming out slowly, like the pull of a river against its banks. "The reason I'm here, why I've been running for so long, is because of my brother. He died because of me." Clara's heart caught in her chest. The weight of those words hung between them, heavy and real. She had never known Tom to speak of his past, to share anything of his life before he arrived in this town. The walls that had surrounded him for so long were now beginning to crumble. "I don't understand," Clara said softly, her voice trembling as she sought to reach the man who had always been so steady, so unyielding. "What happened?" Tom's eyes grew hard, the pain that had once been buried deep, now surfacing like a beast from the dark. "We fought, Clara, my brother and I, over a woman, over land, over things that seemed important at the time, but in the end, it was my fault. He died because I couldn't see past my own pride." Clara's heart broke for him, for the weight of that guilt. She had seen the way he carried himself, the way he protected others, but this was a burden deeper than any wound she could have imagined. "You've carried that burden alone, haven't you?" Clara said, her voice soft with understanding. "You've carried it because you thought you didn't deserve forgiveness." Tom didn't answer right away. Instead, he lowered his gaze as if trying to hide the tears that were beginning to well up in his eyes. "I don't know how to forgive myself, Clara. I don't know how to ask for forgiveness. I've tried to outrun it, to bury it, but it's always there." Clara took a deep breath, her hand still resting on his arm. She could feel the pain radiating from him, the years of regret and silence that had shaped him into the man he was. And yet, in his eyes, there was a flicker of hope, a hope that perhaps, just perhaps, he could find redemption. "I know what it's like to carry pain," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've carried my own burdens, my own regrets, but I've learned that forgiveness doesn't come from anyone but yourself. You can't run from it forever. You have to face it. You have to let go." Tom's face twisted with something resentment, perhaps, or fear. "And what if I can't let go, Clara? What if I'm not worthy of forgiveness?" Clara's heart swelled with compassion for him. She had seen this before, this struggle within a man's soul, the fight between pride and guilt. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting Tom. It means accepting that you're human, that you've made mistakes, and that you're willing to change. You don't have to do it alone. You never have to do it alone. Tom looked at her, then really looked at her, and in that moment something shifted in him. His eyes softened, the hardness of a man who had long buried his pain, giving way to something more vulnerable. "I'm afraid, Clara. I'm afraid that I don't know how to be the man you think I am, that I'm not who you need me to be." Clara smiled gently, her hand sliding to his chest. "I don't need you to be anyone other than who you are, Tom. The man I've come to know. The man who saved me, The man who, I don't know what comes next, but I know that I'm not afraid of the truth anymore. I'm not afraid of you. There was a long silence between them, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Tom took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he looked at her. And for the first time in a long time, he let go. I think I can try, he said, his voice rough but full of possibility. I think I can try to be that man. Clara's heart swelled with warmth, and she reached up to kiss him softly on the cheek. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes, a promise of healing, of moving forward, of facing the truth, no matter how painful. And as the sun sank lower, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold, they sat together in silence, knowing that the road ahead would not be easy, but they would walk it together, one step at a time. The sun dipped low behind the distant mountains, casting a golden hue across the valley. The wind, soft and steady, rustled through the tall grasses, a reminder that life was still unfolding, despite the scars of the past. Clara stood at the edge of the porch, her hands resting on the railing, staring into the horizon. Behind her, the soft sounds of a well-kept home filled the air, the sound of a stove crackling, the steady rhythm of John running about with his newfound energy, and the familiar grounding presence of Tom, who was working quietly on a project by the barn. She let out a long, steady breath and closed her eyes. It had been months since they had arrived here, since that fateful day when Tom had saved them from the clutches of danger, and yet the memories still clung to her like stubborn vines that refused to loosen their grip. For so long she had been running from the fear of being caught, from the deep wounds of betrayal and abandonment. But in these months, she had begun to heal piece by piece. And with that healing came a quiet, undeniable realization. She had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for: a family. The days had begun to stretch longer, and with each passing hour Clara found herself shedding pieces of the past. She no longer flinched when the door opened, no longer feared that it might be someone coming to take them away again. Tom had built her a life piece by piece with his steady hands and quiet presence, but healing was never a straight path. There were moments when Clara would catch herself staring into the distance, lost in thoughts of what had been of her lost family, of the betrayals she had suffered, of the endless days spent in fear. It wasn't that she missed the pain, it was just that the absence of it sometimes felt like a strange void. She didn't know who she was without it. "Ma, you all right?" John's voice broke through her reverie. He was standing in the doorway, his face smudged with dirt from playing outside. Clara smiled softly, shaking her head as she turned to him. "I'm fine, sweetheart," she said, her voice steady. "Just thinking." John came over and took her hand. "You look sad." Clara bent down, looking him in the eyes. "I'm not sad, baby. Just tired, I guess." John nodded, then slipped his hand into hers. "I'm glad we're here. This is our home, right?" Her heart swelled with a bittersweet pride. "Yes, it is. It's ours." Later that evening, after John had fallen asleep, Clara sat by the window, watching the fire flicker in the hearth. She could hear Tom's steady footsteps outside as he walked the perimeter of their land, making sure all was well. It was a sound she had come to rely on, the quiet assurance of a man who would protect them no matter the cost. She knew deep in her bones that Tom was someone she could trust. He had never pushed her for more than she was willing to give. Yet, even now, after all this time, there was something between them that hadn't been said. Something lingering in the air, unspoken, but present, like the dust motes that danced in the sunlight. Clara had spent years closing herself off, hiding from the pain of being hurt, of being betrayed. But with Tom, she felt something different, a quiet strength, a steadfastness that had begun to seep into her soul. But there was still so much left unsaid. The next day, as the sun rose higher in the sky, Tom worked on the barn, his broad back glistening with sweat under the morning sun. Clara stood in the doorway, watching him as he hammered the wooden beams into place. He didn't notice her watching at first, but then as if sensing her gaze, he turned to look at her. His eyes softened, and he gave her a brief smile before returning to his work. It was moments like this, small fleeting moments, that made Clara realize how much had changed since that first day. She hadn't known it then, but her life had begun to shift in ways she couldn't have anticipated. Later that evening, as they sat at the table eating their dinner, Clara caught herself studying Tom. His jaw was set with determination, but there was a quiet weariness to him, an echo of something unspoken. He caught her gaze, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Finally, Tom broke the silence. "You know, I never thought I'd end up like this. I always thought I'd end up alone. Maybe it was easier that way." Clara's heart tightened. "Why do you say that?" Tom took a deep breath, setting down his fork. "Because people always leave, always find a way to hurt you when you least expect it. I thought it would be easier if I just kept to myself away from all of that. But now I'm not sure anymore. Not with you and John." Clara swallowed hard, her heart aching for the man sitting across from her. "You're not alone, Tom. You never were." He looked up at her, his eyes searching hers, and for the first time Clara saw something deeper in them, something vulnerable. He hadn't asked for this life, hadn't asked for the weight of responsibility, but now that he had it, it was clear that it meant something to him. Later that night, after Tom had gone to bed, Clara sat alone in the dim light of the lamp. The house was quiet, save for the occasional crackling of the fire. She felt a weight on her chest, something she had carried for so long, but never truly acknowledged. She had built walls around her heart for so long that it had become second nature. But now, with each day that passed, she felt those walls slowly crumbling piece by piece. The truth was simple. She didn't want to live in fear anymore. Not for herself, not for John, and certainly not for Tom. She knew deep down that she needed to make a choice to either embrace the life they had built together or walk away from it forever, haunted by the ghosts of her past. The following morning, as the sun began to rise, Clara walked to the barn, her steps steady and purposeful. Tom was already there, as always, working diligently. He looked up when he saw her approach. "Clara," he said, his voice soft, uncertain. Clara stood before him, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath and met his gaze. "Tom, I've been running from something for a long time, and I think it's time I stop." Tom's brows furrowed, but before he could say anything, Clara continued, "I want to stay. I want to be here with you and John. I want to build a life, a future with both of you." Tom's eyes softened, and for the first time, a full, genuine smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "I never thought you'd say that." Clara smiled back, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders. "I didn't think I'd say it either." In that moment, something shifted between them, a quiet understanding, a bond that had been forged in the fires of their past struggles, now solidified in the promise of a future they would build together. And as they stood there side by side, Clara knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, not as two broken souls, but as a family. The sun hung low over the rolling hills, casting a warm amber light across the sprawling ranch. The gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the cottonwood trees, a sound that felt like a lullaby. For the first time in years, Clara felt something she hadn't thought possible: peace. She stood at the front porch, her hands resting on the weathered railing, staring out at the vast land before her. The world seemed to stretch endlessly, just as it had always been. But now for her, the land felt different. It no longer seemed like a reminder of all the pain and loss she had suffered. The soil, the wind, the sky, all of it whispered of hope. Behind her, in the warm glow of the kitchen, the soft clink of plates and silverware echoed. The familiar sound of John's laughter filled the air as he and Tom worked together, setting the table. Clara hadn't realized how much she missed the simple sounds of family, how much she longed for the comfort of shared moments, even in silence. She wasn't just living anymore. She was home. "Mom, can you come inside? Dinner's ready?" John's voice was bright, filled with the joy of a child who'd found a place to belong. Clara turned a soft smile tugging at her lips. She walked inside, her heart light. The sight of Tom standing by the stove, his hands steady as he served a dish of roasted vegetables, brought a sense of completeness to the room. He had become more than a protector to them. He had become a part of their lives, in ways she hadn't expected, in ways that felt like a miracle. As she set down her apron and sat at the table, Clara couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them here. It hadn't been an easy road. The path had been lined with betrayal pain and the kind of loneliness that threatened to consume her. She remembered the night she had first met Tom, how she had thought of him as just another stranger, another man who could never understand the depth of her loss. But with each passing day as they worked side by side, fought together for their survival, and healed in each other's presence, she began to see him not as a savior, but as a partner. The truth was, Tom had never just saved her. He had given her the space to save herself. "I'm proud of you." Clara Tom's voice broke through her thoughts. He glanced up from the stove, his eyes soft but serious, the kind of look that always made her feel like he saw straight through her. "You've come a long way. I've seen it in the way you carry yourself now, in the way you talk to John." Clara blinked back the sting of tears. She couldn't remember the last time someone had told her they were proud of her. It was a simple thing, but it felt like a gift she hadn't dared to ask for. "I couldn't have done it without you." Clara replied, her voice thick with emotion. She met his gaze, the weight of the unspoken truth settling between them. "You saved us both." Tom's lips twitched into a small smile, but there was something deeper in his eyes. He had his own demons, his own scars, ones that weren't so easy to hide. Clara knew that. She saw it in the way he sometimes stared at the horizon, lost in thoughts too heavy to share. But for now, there was no need for words. The silence spoke volumes. There was understanding there, a shared knowledge of how far they'd come. John, oblivious to the unspoken exchange, eagerly dug into his meal, his face lit up by the light of the lantern on the table. Clara watched him, her heart swelling with love. This boy, this sweet boy, who had been through so much, who had witnessed so much pain in his short life, was now the light of their little family. For the first time in what felt like forever, Clara felt the weight of her past begin to lift. There was no more running, no more hiding, no more fear. But it hadn't always been this way. Clara had come to this realization slowly. It had taken years, more years than she cared to admit. Her past had clung to her like a shadow, always lurking, always waiting to pounce. Her father's betrayal, the years of abuse, the feeling of being discarded, unworthy of love or protection. It had been a lifetime of carrying around someone else's shame. And then there was the night when it all came crashing down, the night she had finally seen the truth of it. The night Tom had helped her see that she was more than her past, that she was worthy of love, of kindness, of healing. She hadn't known how to forgive, not at first. How could she? How could she forgive a father who had sold her away like cattle? How could she forgive a world that had been so cruel? But then Tom had shown her without words, without promises, that healing wasn't about forgetting the pain. It was about learning how to carry it. It was about understanding that the past didn't have to define who she was. And so, the years passed. Slowly but surely, Clara found herself letting go. Every day was a small step forward, a quiet surrender to the idea that she didn't have to be the broken woman her father had made her. She didn't have to be the woman who'd lived in fear for so long. She was Clara. She was strong. She was enough. Dinner continued in the warmth of the kitchen, the soft clink of silverware, the hum of the oil lamp casting shadows on the walls. But even in this moment of tranquility, Clara couldn't help but think of the one thing that still weighed on her, the truth that had never been spoken. Tom had been her rock, her savior, and yet there was something he had never shared with her, something from his past that had been left unsaid. "Tom," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you." Tom froze for a moment, his hand still hovering over the last serving of food. He turned to her, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" "Clara." She hesitated, but the weight of years of silence was too much. "I want to know your story, all of it, the parts you don't tell." There was a long pause before Tom nodded slowly. He set the ladle down and pulled out a chair across from her. "I'll tell you one day, Clara. When the time's right," he said, his voice calm but heavy, with the knowledge of years past. Clara nodded, accepting the truth of it. Not every wound needed to be healed right away. Some stories could wait. But in that moment she knew. She knew that they had both come far enough to heal together. And in that silence, in the soft glow of the lamp and the quiet hum of their little house, Clara found the courage to forgive. She forgave her father. She forgave herself. And in doing so, she had finally given herself the chance to live again. Later that night, as Clara lay in bed, the wind whispering through the cracks in the walls, she felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Tom standing at the edge of the bed, his presence quiet and strong. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Clara turned to him, her eyes wet with unshed tears. "Yeah," she whispered. "I'm okay. For the first time in a long time, I'm okay." Tom nodded, understanding everything in that moment. He didn't need to say a word. And in the quiet of the night, with the weight of their pasts finally starting to fade, Clara closed her eyes and knew deep in her bones that she was finally home.